ado, I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to be quite brief with the introductions for time's sake, out of no disrespect to the panel, but for time's sake. I'm going to introduce them in the order they are going to speak. So, first, directly to my right, I have Richard Lewis, who is, in a nutshell, a veteran games journalist. At the far end, at the right, is Dr. Mark Coulson. He's a reader and associate professor of psychology at Middlesex University, and he's a contributor to the collection, The Video Games Debate. Right at the far left, we have Sabrina Harris, who's a technical author, long-time gamer, and commentator on internet subcultures. Then in the right on the middle, we have Carl Miller, who is research director, the Centre for Analysis and Social Media at Demus, and is looking at how, and this research centre looks at how the rise of the digital world affects our politics, society, and in a nutshell, us. And then last but not least, directly to my right, I have Christina Hoff-Summers, who is a writer and resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And she's very well known as the host of the weekly video series, The Factual Feminist, on YouTube, I believe. 4 million hits a week.
No. So far.
4 million hits so
I wish.
far. That's still quite impressive. Christina is a renowned public intellectual, I think it is fair to say, as well. I am not going to bang on too much because I think Freddie has said it. It does what it says on the tin, this debate. Is gaming corrupting youth? The panel will have about 5 minutes. I'll be quite strict with timing. Okay. Is gaming corrupting youth? Richard, are you a corrupter of youth or not? Over to you.
Certainly not in the work that I do, I hope. But anyway, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Richard Lewis. I'm a veteran games journalist, and I've been on the front line of games reporting for over a decade, particularly that curious niche called competitive gaming, and I've been doing it before games journalism was so politicised. Indeed, I've got a colleague who used to be a games journalist who's now covering Middle Eastern politics, and he recently messaged me and said he'd never go back because his current job is less inflammatory and dangerous. I must also apologise for my voice. I picked up a bit of a cold. I was out at a gaming event in Serbia, which made it touch and go if I could attend this event, so apologies about that in advance. And I can only assume it was a similar affliction that led to the withdrawal of the Guardian's Keith Stewart, rather than a flagrant act of intellectual cowardice and disrespect to the panellists and audience.
It wasn't.
Anyway, when framing this debate, I think it's important we talk about moral panic, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to get right into that. I'm not going to tell you anything that you haven't heard before. But anyway, when talking about it, we have to look at, historically, how all societies have deviated towards these moral panics. And it's a convergence of two phenomena. So first, civilized societies sort of historically have feared that there will always be some force that they don't understand that will infiltrate the ranks of the youth and corrupt them. And this in turn will lead them to dismantle the society that the old and wise generation before us all has built. So that's seen there historically. If you think this is anything new, I suggest you read upon the trial of Socrates. Which brings me to the second phenomenon, which is, of course, the invention of moral panic. And it is an observable phenomenon in relatively stable and comfortable countries, certainly in the West, where in the absence of real problems, we strive to create false ones because too many businesses depend on it. So first and foremost, the mainstream media. And, of course, second of all, any company, charity or group that can claim to peddle the cure to this newfound societal ailment. So there'll be those of you here, older than I, who will recall how Elvis Presley's unfettered pelvic thrusting, now known as the patriarchy salute, was going to drive the youth wild with rebellion fueled by a Dionysus-like approach to sexual freedom and revelry. And of course that never happened, and you will see a few disappointed aging faces, I'm sure, around the audience to testify to that fact. I've always been a nerd, so my first rub with moral panic was Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, a few knowing laughs in the audience there. The media said that this mere game of papers, pencil and dice and models, if you could afford them, could and would invoke Satan. It was compared to a Ouija... don't laugh, this is true. It was compared to a Ouija board, and I remember my mother eyeing my bestiaries and compendiums with a newfound alarm after a TV detective show called Target featured a group addicted to Dungeons and Dragons involved in not only a murder, but the IRA. It's true, I can't remember the name of it, but Google it. After that, it was nunchucks or nunchaku, the Japanese fighting sticks that would bring about the fall of Western civilization. They were portrayed as the most deadly weapon in the world, and it was clumsily edited out of Enter the Dragon, the film. Now, if you go on YouTube, you'll see plenty of clips of people using these deadly weapons and injuring only themselves. It'll remind you of the Darwin Awards. Next, we had Video Nasties, films so evil and depraved that no one must ever see them except a board of educated upper-class intelligentsia who are simply too intellectual and wealthy to be corrupted by what us mere plebs cannot be exposed to. And onward it goes, rock music, gangster rap, even Harry Potter, a child's book read primarily by adults, was accused of promoting witchcraft, and which brings me on to games. So they've come after gaming a number of times, and sometimes it's very general. So games make us violent, games encourage school shootings, so much so that the first line of inquiry in these tragedies is often what games did they play. Games are pornographic, games are as addictive as opiates, and games make us antisocial. They can be oddly specific as well, such as the Daily Mail's absurd claims that Call of Duty is used by jihadis as a terrorist training tool. I'll let you insert an obligatory joke about respawning here. Christian groups have also attacked Pokemon, claiming it's a game that teaches children about the occult, or even worse, evolution. Yeah. Most recently, we had to read about a GTA, that's Grand Theft Auto mod, that enabled virtual rape, which of course was no more than the long-standing practice of honest-to-goodness teabagging invoked by gamers. It was described as a disturbing new trend in the Telegraph. So what does the science say? Well, I'm not going to bang too much on about that, as we've got certainly people who are better qualified. But ultimately, the science doesn't point to anything that would make us think we are being systematically corrupted by being exposed to gaming. So I will throw you over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Mark Coulson, at this juncture to do it.
Oh, my goodness, you're taking over the chairs?
Sorry, no. I just want to be succinct and on point, I think.
Great introduction. Can I just say, let's stick to the debate at hand, and if people aren't here, they're not here, is what I would say. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'll take a slightly contrary line, I think, to Richard. I think as a psychologist, one of the things that we observe is that everybody, children especially, are impressionable. When we look at the content of modern games, we see excessive violence, we see over-sexualization, we see even misogyny and amoral behavior. And I think it's very straightforward. In fact, it's pretty much self-evidently true that these games are corrupting youth. I think it's self-evidently true in exactly the same way that it's pretty obvious that the Earth is flat and that the sun goes round it, and that opposites attract, smoking is good for you, and that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. Of course, we know that all of these self-evident truths are in fact false. I hope you think they're false, because they are. How do we know this? Well, we know this through the very thorough, the very careful, and the very detailed and public activity that we call science. When we look at the scientific data, then just like Galileo dropping cannonballs off the Tower of Pisa, the sacred cows of our beliefs, our moral panics, are slaughtered in front of us. We do not see a rise in violent crime, despite the fact, as Freddie observed, that sales of video games have soared over the past few decades. Violent crime is decreasing. We don't see an increase in amorality. Our children are as adept at knowing the difference between fantasy and reality as they ever were. We also don't see a descent into an easy, effortless life of meaningless pleasure. Sigmund Freud taught us 100 years ago that that's the way we are. We're like that. Society isn't an invention, takes us away from our base human nature. And in fact, those parts of the brain that enable us to overcome that base human nature are the very parts of the brain that games exercise, our frontal lobes. Play is a very fundamental feature of our species, not just our species, but other species as well. Play enables us to experience things that we wouldn't be able to experience otherwise. It offers us safe environments in which we can be other things, we can carry out other acts, we can learn the consequences of actions that we might never actually engage with in normal life. And that is a good thing. Thank you. I shall not introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. Very succinct. Thank you, Mark. Sabrina, over to you.
So we've already got some experts on the panel on the violence thing, so I'm not going to concentrate too much on that. But to elaborate on the whole moral panic thing, I think that like a conversation about today's youth is also a conversation about the future of society, because our collective fears are projected onto young people, and I think that's why so many moral panics focus on them. And obviously gaming is absolutely no exception, and it follows in the footsteps of panics over other media like TV and film. I think if you did believe all the headlines you saw about video games, you would think that they're going to end the world, really. It's ridiculous. I mean, between the right-wing press's fixation with games causing violence and the left-wing obsessed with their supposed misogyny, I think it's undeniable that fear-mongering about video games gets clicks and attention, and it's very predictable. As we've already said, I think studies have yet to establish any serious connection here to violent acts, even including research papers with incredibly flawed methodology. We're talking tiny sample sizes and really very odd ways of measuring aggression in some cases. So I think, you know, if there really was an endemic problem, we would absolutely have much more evidence right now. We would be able to point to it. This is research which has gone on since the 80s. It's been going on for decades, and there's still nothing out there which really points to a big link. So, yeah. I think that the allegation that they cause or perpetuate sexism or misogyny is similarly unfounded. I've used both words because feminism seems dead set on like watering down misogyny these days. I mean, you know, you've got a skimpily clad woman, misogyny. I don't think that's a very fair criticism. So I will just want to go on to some problems that I've got with feminist criticisms of video games. The first one is that there's often there's a selective use of evidence. You know, things are taken out of context so much. You see like a couple of skimpily clad women in a video game, and that's used as evidence that the whole game is sexist, you know. Video games are very complex. There's a lot of framing issues. I mean, stuff talks about, it frequently ignores things like mechanics and, you know, like the broader context of the game. I mean, Anita Sarkeesian is particularly famous for doing this. And when she's talking about video games and saying, okay, you know, you're encouraged to kill these female characters, when actually you're not, there may be a system in place which penalizes you for doing so, or you can kill women, blah, 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 but you can actually kill both genders. There's absolutely no preferential treatment there. That's a problem, that this is being used as a weapon. The second issue, I think, is that a lot of feminist criticism, like with the stuff about violence, it's more about removing content which they personally find distasteful rather than removing stuff which is actually harmful. And I think we need the evidence first rather than, you know, jumping to conclusions, basically. I don't think the evidence is there. The third problem I have is I've been gaming since I was a little kid. I know many women who have as well, and we are frequently erased in these discussions. You know, we are ignored, and it's just not very fair, really. And I don't think it takes stock of how diverse games have always been, are at the moment. You know, I think it's around 5 and 10% of games released in the last 5 years are rated mature. And then the rest of them have all levels of content. You've got all sorts of games out there. There are, you know, action-adventure ones, there's RPGs, and there's just this tunnel vision on certain types of games. So I think that's a real problem as well. I'm going to finish up with a quote for you, which is something I'm a little bit alarmed by. This is a feminist games journalist, and I will quote, "By 1996, most of my female classmates had stopped playing video games. I think some of this had to do with societal pressures, but the rest of it had to do with the N64. Even now, its controller is nonsense. In 1996, it was outright galling. Where had all these buttons come from? Why was it shaped like that? Why was there an analog stick stuck in the middle of it?" I think this is a really big problem. It's so insulting as a woman to, you know, have these kinds of allegations thrown out that women can't cope with the complexity of video games. Another developer recently said that, oh, women prefer low poly counts. I mean, what on earth? This is sexism. That is sexism. It's not a problem of gaming being sexism. It's a problem of feminist criticism being sexist.
Thank you, Sabrina. Carl, evidence or not?
Evidence or not, well, everybody, very, very good afternoon. I loved the N64 controller, incidentally. GoldenEye on N64 was one of my first entries into gaming. Well, I hate going at the rump end of panels, ladies and gentlemen, for the simple reason that I've sat here in horror. I've been keeping it quite together on my face, but I've been screaming inside horror, checking off all my points already being raised by all of the panelists. It's awful. So I've binned half of the things I was going to say. I mean, of course, yes. Firstly, there is always something which is trying to corrupt our youth. There is always a new technology which is being worried about. And in Plato's time, it was letters. They promote forgetfulness. We would become the heroes of many things, and we'll have learned nothing. During the time of Johannes Gutenberg, as books were rolling off his life-changing press, it was the confusing and harmful, overwhelming amount of data that was being thrown at everyone. TVs, radios, newspapers, comic books. If anyone doesn't think that comic books were the source of a massive moral panic. There was in the 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent, which was absolutely railing about the capacity of comic books to undermine and degrade the stature of the moral stature of our youth. And the list goes on and on. I mean, and there are some comedy ones and probably quite some serious ones in there. Alongside Harry Potter and Dungeons and Dragons, we had Twilight, Pokemon, and the Beatles. But we also had actually quite serious issues with which the moral panic's about. And as each generation comes across, it has to desperately try and deal with the question of how do we actually, in a time of radical change, radical social and political and technological change, how do we keep our hands on what makes us good as well as more capable? How does society actually develop morally as much as it develops in any other way? So the moral panics are always part of society and not necessarily a bad part of it. I actually want to live as part of society which is currently inward looking and constantly on watch and on guard, that things can actually damage society as much as improve them. And the question nowadays of the rise of the internet and the digital world alongside gaming is actually, to me, not actually a close question about whether we're becoming a moral society. Every single day I work on issues about people using the internet and the digital world to treat one another in horrendous ways. And I actually don't think that we use technology in many ways to actually be better to one another. I think we lack lots of concepts now about digital citizenship, about actually having responsibility to one another when we're playing games, when we go on the internet, when we use social media and so on. And this question of whether games makes us more violent, this specific proposition, is actually taken seriously by policymakers. So in 2013, Obama actually announced a raft of new funding for academic work into trying to prove or dispute this causal link. And actually, I think the academic community let us down in these intervening few years. It is perhaps an irony that the academic community has descended into bitter acrimony itself over whether games make us more violent or not. I'll quote you. Now, you have to remember, this is taken out of a fairly arid and formal academic paper, and it says the following. And this is written by one of the people that were up to their neck in this debate. Some scholars actively and aggressively attempt to quell dissenting views, disparage skeptics, question the motives of those who disagree with them, and enforce a highly ideological view of the field, complained this academic. This leads us to wonder what it is about doing aggression research that seems to make scholars themselves so aggressive. And therefore, policymakers really have struggled to actually react to this problem, because the empirical view, which everyone's been looking to the academic community to try and sort out for us, has remained so obscure. I mean, there are a series of slugging matches going on currently between different academic groups that all seem to put out theories on one side or another, and all consistent with the same group as itself. So this question is, I think, the link between video games and violence, whilst not necessarily being proven one way or another, we haven't actually, as a society, gone about proving it in a very good process at all, I think. I think the academic work on this has been quite thin and certainly politicised. But the final point I want to make, I think, is this, that if indeed it is evidenced at some point that video games lead to either violent behaviour or poor treatment of women or poor treatment of minority communities or so on, I think it also is liberating our youth as much as it is corrupting them. And I think that video games allow us to do those things which makes us feel human. Whether that is the discovery of watching someone walk to the edge of the Minecraft world, whether that is the capacity to work within systems and rules which reward us when we try hard, which allows us to develop social kudos or recognition or esteem in areas which seem like other areas of life seem to have been denied from us. Whether it allows us to go into the kind of back of beyond in Grand Theft Auto and try and find Bigfoot that Rockstar constantly denies is there, yet there is, I think, overwhelming video evidence that Bigfoot itself exists. or whether it's simply social belonging. And from my, I'm a recovering gamer. From my own experience of it, it was that actually which kept me in games. It was those endline MPORGs which made me feel like I was actually part of something, which made me feel like I was part of a community and part of a team where I could work with others to achieve the aims. I mean, I felt in those destabilising times in our late teens and early 20s, I took great refuge there. I took great meaning and comfort. I mean, we used to joke that leaving the game was logging on, not logging off. I mean, for us, the world behind that screen was more real than the one in real life. And for all those reasons, I think video games is art. It is aesthetic and social appreciation. It is emotional appreciation. It does so much to liberate us. It does so much to liberate young people too. And I think that as video games now are maturing, and I would love to see the same, thank you, I'd love to see the same kind of sophisticated cultural commentary that we have with films and with theatre now happen with video games as well. I think it's incredible that we don't. I think the questions like this actually will leave behind, and it won't be any kind of genre-wide criticisms. It would be, can you imagine if this was as art corrupting society, or can you imagine as theatre corrupting society? I mean, it's actually pretty, I think, endemic of this still being a kind of first-generation step. And I think that as video games become accepted, really, as one of the major ways in which we express ourselves, it will become a question of each game rather than a question as a genre and as a whole.
Thank you, Carl. Christina, if Carl's nervous of being the rump, you really are the rump, but I'm sure it's going to be great. Over to you.
No, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm so impressed with the battle of ideas and many people that I've met. I'm sorry that Keith Stewart didn't come from The Guardian, because he would have disagreed with us. We would have had a debate, and I think he complained that he felt this was not a balanced panel, but all the more reason to come and be the voice of truth and reason and show all of us to be so irrational. I have done that on many occasions myself. I have gone to debates where I'm greatly outnumbered, so I'm very disappointed he's not here, and I am going to reinforce some of what you've heard, and others, you can challenge this. When I wrote a book called The War Against Boys some years back, before I knew much about video games, and I planned to include a section where I was going to argue that we were failing our young men by exposing them to this toxic form of play. I didn't know what I was talking about, but I was a responsible scholar, and I wasn't happy simply to quote some anguished politicians and some concernocrats wringing their hands. I wanted to see data, and I couldn't get it. I would find you can find a bunch of experiments that suggest that after playing Grand Theft Auto, some children might be more, show less sympathy, but they couldn't. There were no good longitudinal studies over time. We couldn't see, and then I saw this amazing data, and it's been mentioned here, that, for example, the millennial generation, video game nation, brought up on games, they were among you, some of you in that generation, are among the most law-abiding and sort of polite generation compared to others, just less mayhem all around compared to my generation. The baby boomers are worst of all. If somebody's in the emergency room for an overdose, it's a baby boomer more likely than a millennial. So I couldn't find it. In fact, I found the reverse. I found that there was, I don't say there's a correlation, but if you look at the rise of the millennial generation and playing games, crime is going down, and misbehavior of all sorts. But then there was a second thing. I have two sons who played games. They played, it was called Madden Football. Okay, they played this downstairs compulsively and all the time. And I wanted to be worried about it, but I'd go down, they'd rush downstairs with their friends, and what I would see was not alienated young men. I would see happy kids bonding with their friends. There was some trash talk, but they were forming these, it was friendship. It was happiness. It was play. And I had read a lot about play for this book, because you may have heard a lot of little boys thrown out of school for in one notorious case in the United States, a little boy chewed a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun, and he was, thought to be problematic and suspended for a few days. We have lots of these cases. And increasingly, adults are frowning on the play of little boys, the typical play of young boys. Girls do it too, but boys do it a lot more. It's called rough and tumble play. There's a lot of mock fighting, sound effects, chasing. It is the opposite of violence. According to, for example, experts in playground dynamics, Anthony Pellegrini at the University of Minnesota, he's a great champion of rough and tumble play. He said it's the high-spirited plays of young males everywhere. And even in other species, it's known to happen. And as I said, girls do it too, but they do it a lot less. If you watch little girls play, there's a certain amount of R&T, they call it, rough and tumble. But there's also turn-taking games and, above all, imaginative theatrical games. I used to like to play school with my friends, playing house, playing school. And so girls play is much more. Boys, with few exceptions, there's the rough and tumble. And increasingly, adults don't see the difference. They will say, well, this is violent, because they're chasing each other, and one saying, I'm going to kill you, and bam, they play swords, and it's pretend. And they're forging friendships, and boys who are good at rough and tumble play are popular. Boys who are violent, you don't see happiness, you see tears. They part as enemies. Boys who are really violent are not well socialized, usually well liked. What I see in video games is the need for the same kind of analysis, because when it is play, it's not literally what you're seeing. You're seeing something quite different. It's imaginative engagement, and again with the bonds with others. And so I did not write. I didn't defend video games. I just thought, I have to come back to that sometime because there's a lot of misinformation here. And I made that note, and then by the time I came back to it, that's the moment that this Gamergate controversy hit, so I sort of got involved in that too. So the next point I want to make is that, there's a remarkable book called The Ambiguity Play by Brian Sutton Smith, and he explains that when kids get together and play video games that include a lot of battles and fighting, it looks like fighting, he said, but it's the very opposite of fighting. This is a quote, carried out by those who are not enemies and who do not intend to harm each other. So I've determined that video games, like the rough and tumble play, it's a healthy pastime. It's a healthy form of enjoyment. And if your child does it a lot, it's more likely to lead to a career in tech than to become a sociopathic killer that we hear in the press. So what about sexism and misogyny? A senior reporter at Polygon spoke for many feminist critics when he noted that negative depictions of women in games help to, quote, justify the unequal treatment of women in real life, fewer opportunities than men, lower wages than men, violence from men. The list is almost endless. And I should add, he wrote that in response to a video that I made in my series defending video games. Now, it's true that some games depict horrific violence and mistreatment of women, but there's almost always more mistreatment of men, and it's almost always, as I said, it's fantasy. I did look at, I'm not a gamer, but I looked at some of these games, and I didn't like what I saw in Grand Theft Auto. It looked too violent. I wouldn't want to play it. But I frustrate my children by I couldn't watch Breaking Bad or The Sopranos. They were too violent. It's not for me. I would like, if I played video games, sort of themes from Downton Abbey or The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. I think my children played The Oregon Trail, if anyone remember that, and I thought that was a nice game. But but I don't require video games to conform to my tastes, and I think that behavior should conform to some version of the golden rule, but the rules of fantasy are more permissive. And look at children's fairy tales, and there's a lot of violence and mistreatment, and sometimes women are, I don't know, there was some woman came to a bad end in Hansel and Gretel, I recall. So I'll just, I'm going to come back to something I didn't have time for, but I'm simply going to say there is little evidence that these games are harmful. And not to be provocative, but I would say that what I worry about now, and I want more studies, is that I look at this third wave, trigger warning, safe space, check your privilege feminism that we're now seeing erupting, and that does appear to cause harm and engender misery, but we need more studies on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Great introductions. Thank you. And do